Daniel and Harry, thanks so much for sitting down and taking a moment to talk to us about specifically Reliable Furniture. I've heard a lot about this place, but I actually don't know anything about it. So we were hoping to just sit down and Harry talked a little bit more about your background, your past, and your experiences in Flint and how Reliable got started. So let me start by just asking, when did you come to Flint? And then this is kind of just a conversation between the two of you. But when did you come to Flint?
1924. My mother and father married in Newark, New Jersey, and they immediately came to Flint because they had relatives there. And my mother became pregnant. She wanted to have her first child where her parents lived, in Newark, New Jersey. So she and I got on a train, went to Newark. I was born in Newark, and after a couple of weeks, we returned to Flint, and I lived in Flint.
Where in Flint did you live?
Oh, it began in the north end of Flint, and we were changing apartments, and mainly in the north part of Flint. And as years went on, we went to, eventually my brother and I bought a house for our parents off Court Street and near Dort Highway. And eventually I got married, and I lived in the west side of Flint, and various apartments until I built my house. And that was the best move I made. It was a big house, had 3 children, and each child had an apartment, had a room, and the house was it was just a perfect layout. I was going to college. After a few years, and a traveling recruiting board was going around to all those colleges and universities in Michigan, and they told the men that if they enlisted, they would be deferred for their education. They came to Flint, Michigan, to this small college in Flint. 14 of us lined up. They accepted 13, turned down 1, me. So I went up to the major and I said, "You took my 3 friends. How come you didn't take me?" He said, "You can't see." I did have bad eyesight. I began arguing with him, and I could see he was getting antsy. He wanted to leave. He finally said, "Take your eye test with your glasses on." I passed. I was in Army Reserve. March of 43, the dean came out of his office. He said, "Boys, you have a week to take care of your business. You're in active duty." So that's when our Army career began. And I don't know if you want to hear about all that.
If you want to share it with me, I'm all ears.
Where were you stationed?
My basic training was in Clearwater, St. Petersburg, in Florida. Our barracks was the largest wooden structured hotel in the world. And our basic training was on what had been the golf course. And after basic training, a group of us was sent to shark. I can't remember some of these names.
It's okay.
Chillicothe, Missouri, to a business school. And we were there for a couple of months, returned to Florida, and we immediately was shipped overseas. Our ship came into Le Havre, France. We were all up on deck just looking at the city, and they started announcing names. And I said to my buddies, this doesn't sound good. We haven't even gotten on the ground yet. And they kept calling names. And I said to my Army cohorts, if my name is called and we're going where I think we're going, and I lose my glasses, I'm going to shoot at anything in front of me. Luckily, my name was not called. All the men that were called got off the ship, and sure enough, they went into battle, and immediately, it didn't turn out good. The rest of us went to a French armory in France, and we were there for a few weeks. And one evening, I remember one evening they announced that our President Roosevelt had died, and that we have a new president, Harry Truman, who most of us didn't mean anything. But then a few days later, they started calling names off again, and we were sent to a huge empty spot at the foot of the Remagen Bridge in the Rhine River, on the foot of the Rhine River. And we were told that we were going to have 10,000 German prisoners come in. We were told we would send them to permanent POW camps, and then we would go back to France. Within 45 days, we had 165,000 prisoners, and we were near the Ruhr Valley, and the war was coming to an end. And these German soldiers were coming in by the hundreds every day. And the war ended. So after a short period at this camp, a whole group of us were sent to Charleville, France. 5,000 of us got on a ship, and the ship took off, and it sounded and it looked like we were heading back to the United States. Well, we ended up going through the Panama Canal, heading out into the Pacific Ocean, and we just kept going further in the Pacific, and eventually we realized we were going to be the first troops to land in Japan. And somebody told us that the first 200,000 troops were going to be expendable. Well, that didn't sound too good. About 2 or 3 days before we were going to land in Japan, 5 o'clock news came on deck, and they announced an atomic bomb had been dropped on Japan. And then a second one had been dropped, and the war in the Pacific was over suddenly. And to this day, I regret not sending President Truman a note thanking him for saving my life, because we would never have made it if we had landed in Japan. And so our ship made a U-turn. We ran into a typhoon. Wind instruments broke at 150 miles an hour. And for 4 days, we rode out that typhoon. And eventually we came into the harbor at Okinawa. We got off the ship, and we were stationed I can't tell you exactly the exact spot, but I remember I was in a port battalion for a short while, and then transferred to quartermaster on the shores of the China Sea. And one day, 6 of us were standing in this empty, huge tent, and suddenly I looked up, and this huge support started coming down, and I yelled to everybody to get out. The tent came down, the wind started blowing, and within 24 hours, a typhoon came up, and again, wind instruments, the Navy wind instruments broke at 120 miles an hour, and everything that we lived in was just blown away. And we survived. After a couple of days, the typhoon was over, and life started again. So, Army life was not terrible once the war was over. And many months later, they called out numbers of soldiers going back to the United States. And I was one of the soldiers. And we boarded the ship, came into Seattle, Washington, and then we transferred to a camp in Michigan, and we were discharged. That was the end of I was in the Army for 3 years. And I came home, and my civilian days started. So this could go on forever.
So 1928, the business gets started. Why was it started on Industrial Avenue?
Because Leo Binder had to decide if he wanted to build a building on Industrial Avenue or Saginaw Street. And he picked Industrial Avenue because of all the traffic of workers coming and going out of the GM factories. And it was successful. He began as a used furniture store, and he had a 4-wheel trailer built, and once a week he went to Detroit to this supplier and loaded the trailer, came back to Flint with furniture, unloaded, and he was ready for business in the morning. And he did this every week.
What was it like? You were 4 when the store opened. What do you remember?
It was not a neat store. The furniture was just spread out all over the place. My father came home in the middle of the night, it seemed like. He unloaded this trailer, and to this day I regret just knowing how hard he worked to get all the furniture into the store. And he managed to get a couple of hours of sleep, got up and opened the door to the store and started the day.
And the customers were primarily from Buick? Mostly from Buick? Your customers, or the customers from Reliable?
There were all kinds of, a lot of farmers. It was the Depression. And so many people came in, needed furniture, but had no money. So I remember we ate well because the farmers paid us with produce, and other people. My father ended up with, remember, beautiful watches and different kinds of jewelry. But somehow he managed to earn a living.
When did my dad and you get more involved in the business? What year did that?
Well, it was years before I got involved because I was still a little boy. And he ran the business by himself. He always used to say that these young men, 6'4" tall and healthy looking, came in begging for a job. And he let them know that he couldn't afford to support himself, much less have somebody else. And they understood.
The interesting thing about this business, which my uncle talks about, is that much of the business model for its existence was based on the idea that customers needed credit. And Reliable was core to making sure that customers had credit. And that was the model. And you look at signs on the store from the early 40s, from the mid 40s, even in the 50s, and the business model was rooms of furniture, easy credit or no money down.
He's right. That's
And what Harry will get to is the integrity of of my father, my uncle, and his dad was extraordinary, and they were trusted, and they were appreciated, and customers knew that they were in business to make a profit, but they didn't take advantage of their customer, and the customers understood that, and so they were always differentiated in the neighborhood for this extraordinary amount of integrity and this extraordinary work ethic.
In those days, they would buy something and set up a weekly payment program, which could amount to 50 cents a week, $1 a week, anything that they felt they could afford. And the store owners went along with that.
What do you miss about that routine? What do you miss about your day-to-day routine from Reliable back in the early days?
I remember I got to an age where I could help around the store, and I cleaned some of the used furniture to have it ready for sale. He used to get not only furniture, musical instruments. One day, my mother said to me, "You're going to take violin lessons." Here I was 8 or 9 years old. I didn't know what a violin was, but a violin came in. She found a young man about 5 blocks down the street who played the violin. She made arrangements for him to give me a violin lesson. So every Saturday morning, she gave me 50 cents. I walked down to his house. I got a violin lesson. He taught me how to play the violin. When I came out of service, the first thing I did was sell the violin. And to this day, I have no idea why I did that, because I would have liked to have continued with it. But I came out of service. I was in the Army for 3 years, and his father and I discussed our future, and we decided to go into the furniture business, but new furniture and new appliances. And that's the way the modern, reliable furniture began. And it was a slow process because we had no money, and to this day, I just can't believe we survived the beginning of this new operation. But we found manufacturers and appliance suppliers furnish us with whatever we wanted. And it took a few years, but we became successful.
I am younger, obviously, than my uncle, and my father and my uncle, I guess, 18 months apart from each other. But they worked really, really hard. And the support that they would get from the manufacturers for a little store, on the north end of Flint, with a business model that was all terms, there was no cash that necessarily traded hands, was extraordinary. And the customers adored the two of them without exception, but the manufacturers adored them to a point where even in the 40s and the 50s, when you would go to a manufacturer, they would come to us and they would show their samples, and there would be a routine, and we would get furniture selections that very few people got on the scale that we would get because of our reputation. And the two of them paid their bills on time, no matter what the economics were, and always made sure that that relationship stood. So there were fresh goods, always fresh products, always fresh appliances or fresh furniture pieces always on the floor. And as the customer came back, because they would pay their bill over time, they bought more, and the family and friends of the customer would buy more. And it was a fascinating thing at age 3 or 4 when the store was still on Industrial Avenue. It was just amazing to see how many customers would return and how deeply integrated the two of them were with each of them and their families and their friends. And I think of Flint, and I think of the various businesses that we competed with, and ours was a lot to be proud of, and certainly a lot to respect for the fact that the integrity and the honesty and the attention to the customer and the priority of the customer was just so unique. Never rehearsed, just very natural.
To the day we closed, our reputation was high. And after we had closed the store, people used to stop me in a supermarket and tell me they still have the furniture that they bought 20 years ago, and how great it was and how much they enjoyed dealing with us. It was just a great feeling.
And they were quick to point out that they might need to buy something else because it was 20 years old, but they were tactful about that, but they were pretty good at influencing new purchases.
After we closed the store, our customers still wanted to buy from us. So I made arrangements with, I remember this, it was ABC Appliances on
Miller Road.
Miller Road.
Yeah.
And I would take the customer to see what they wanted, and they would buy. We made arrangements. They had an account with us. They got what they wanted, and we did business like that for a while.
You think about 1928 and then all the way to 1983. What are you most proud about?
The pride we took in running the store, and how the customers enjoyed dealing with us. We rarely had a dissatisfied customer. I can't think of what else.
I loved the store. I loved the business model. I was so infatuated by the closeness of these customers and how this business, through all the change in Flint, this business model that addressed these customers was just so distinct. And it's true. Wherever I went or wherever I was with my father, sometimes with you, you'd run into people and they would ask how you are, or they would ask how my father was. And they knew us so well, they asked about the children, they wanted to know where we were with school. But some of these customers were as close to us as our own families. And I don't remember businesses like that. And I was just impressed. And the focus, how you prioritize the customer was pretty incredible. And I just found it infectious to see a business run. You go out as a student in high school or junior high school and you go to other businesses, and then you'd watch, an uncle or a father working every day. And to me, it was extraordinary. And I think that's how customers saw Reliable for the longest time.
It just so happened that the store was located in a neighborhood that was predominantly European, and many Polish people lived there. And our parents talked Polish because that's where they came from. So I used to watch them make a sale, didn't have the customers sign anything, and just have the furniture delivered. It was that kind of operation.
I would watch later in the 70s, and the business had moved to Corona Road at that point, and I'd watch they interact with a customer, and they could look at the customer straight in the eye and make a transaction with limited documentation because they trusted the customer, and the customer knew to trust them. And it was a forever relationship, but it was sincere, and the business was different. A result of that, and very, very special on so many fronts. And think about my grandfather and when he got started, and he was an immigrant, and English was not comfortable for him in the beginning, but he knew the value and the after effect of hard work, and so he worked, and he worked really hard. And those values continued for decades, and the model evolved. But such amount of the business that was core to the business around the customer and the work ethic, integrity was extraordinarily unique at this business and different than many other businesses, was just very, very special from my recollection.
Yes.
What do you miss about Reliable?
Just getting up in the morning and knowing there was someplace great to go to work. Never knew what was going to happen, but we made a good living. Seemed like we didn't have to knock ourselves out. And it just seems like we made a sale and had a satisfied customer and had the furniture delivered to their house. And it was just a good program, that's all.
I reflect, watched the Flint economy change a lot, and was always impressed with at the calmness and the fortitude of my dad and you at keeping the business model core to what it stood for. You never moved into alternate directions. You stayed very focused on the basic DNA of the business. And to me, that was always impressive. And for a city that went through so much change between General Motors, reductions in people, and just the amount of spend that left the economy, you nourished through that, because I'm very certain that what differentiated Reliable was integrity and trust, and you stayed focused on what your customers wanted.
Well, as time went on, large competition came to Flint, and it affected the furniture business. And dozens of furniture stores closed because of that. And we were one of the few stores that continued on for a few years before we decided to close. I remember about promoting the store, we decided to do TV commercials. My brother and I would make our own commercials. And they weren't sophisticated, but people didn't forget them. The first commercial that was made, we're talking about cutting prices and having quality furniture, and when we got to the point where we talked about cutting the prices on all our, having a sale and having a sale, I pulled out a pair of scissors and grabbed my brother's tie, which was a beautiful tie, and I cut the tie into that commercial was never forgotten. And in fact, I remember one day going before a judge over some minor item that happened in the store, and I got up for him, and the first thing he did was just remembering the commercial.
I think it's funny you bring up cleaning as one of your first assignments. So, 6 children, 3 on my father and 3 with you, all had cleaning assignments for a summer or after school or on a weekend on Corona Road. I think I used to vacuum not very well, or dust. David would go in, Abby would go in, my brother would go in, or we would clean the parking lot. But we all had some relationship with the cleaning part of the business, as I recall. What frustrated you so much? What would frustrate you at reliable periods of time?
Well, as the years went by, it seemed like the customer was they came in with an antagonistic attitude, and it was just hard to deal with them. And we stayed calm, but it was getting more difficult to do business.
I remember instances when, customers would come in Friday night and Dad would be on shift at that point, and somebody would come in and complain about the quality of a piece of furniture and would gnaw at him, or if you were there for a price concession, because they felt the quality wasn't there. But for sure, there was a real change in the late 70s. In the early 80s, there was a real change where customers got far more specific about what they thought they should have or what they don't have. But
Right.
I went on in my life into retail, and that was my career, and did a lot of things. And when I reflect on my own career, so much of what Reliable did was so much ahead of its time, and so it would deal with those circumstances. So you all created private sales long before people had private sales, and you had special loyalty programs that didn't even exist back then, where you had specific customers that were on rosters, and you had, notations of those customers, and you knew how to customize how you could present things to that customer, and that was special. And you did pre-events long before that was done. And so I always found that somehow, because you were so close to the customer and you understood them, somehow you figured it out, and didn't ever think it was easy, but somehow both of you figured that out with incredible cadence and sophistication. And the TV ads were pretty good. They were funny. So it helped us in high school, particular, because most of our friends would talk about those TV ads. They ran an ad series where they were announced that you guys were presidents of the day. And so you would announce on Monday you were the president, my dad was the president on Tuesday. Customers would walk in the front door, this would be on Corona Road, and say, I want to talk only to the president. So, and if you weren't there, some of them would say, well, we'll wait for the president to come in, we're only talking to the president. So, but again, to me, the thing that resonates, and it was always drilled into me later in life, is there's nothing more important than that relationship with your customer. And Flint was a good place at the end of the day to do business, and a captive audience and a captive customer base, and they liked us. And that was always very impressive. And I never thought that you took advantage of that. I always felt like it was forever appreciated, and never taken for granted, and always, looked ahead for what you had to do differently as the customer changed. And impressive thoughts.
we used to open up our commercials with Leo, Harry, and Al. Our father was Leo, and then my brother Al, and me, Harry. And people remembered that. It was nice.
So think about 1928 and your experience with Dad. What would you give advice? What advice would you give to somebody today to start a business?
Just to be friendly with the customer who's looking for furniture, and not giving them a hard time. Our prices were always correct, nothing overly priced, and people accepted that. So we just continued on in business like that.
In my career journey, I think the one thing that never changed, no matter how much the world changed, is you have to know your customer. And you have to stay focused on your business model. And Reliable, without exception, knew its customer and always stayed focused on its business model. Never tried once to be something that it wasn't. Was
That's
just
right.
a very, very specific business model and something to be proud about. And so it lasted for a very long time through extraordinary financial changes in the city because the customer base was a base that trusted Reliable, and Reliable trusted the customer. That's what always impressed me about my father and you, is that you were so specific toward the customer.
Flint had dozens and dozens of furniture stores in its heyday. And as time went on, the stores closed. At the end, I think there were 3 or 4 major furniture stores, and the rest were all gone.
It's true. And Northern Flint changed a lot.
Oh,
And obviously, Buick went through its share of changes, and the business, the economy moved drastically, but somehow, well into the 70s and into the early 80s, Reliable figured out how to stay stable and nurture a good life for 2 families, and customers always appreciated that. And, growing up for me in Flint, and I would say this to my father all the time, I'd go into high school and people would come up to me and they say, "Is your dad Al?" Or "How are you related to Harry?" And I would describe it and they'd say, "Wow, they're good guys." And I don't know how many of us would go to high school and get our peers to say something about our fathers in that respect. And, I was always very proud of that and found that to be particularly cool and distinct. And then I could go to Reliable, at the end of the day after high school, and I could watch it and saw 2 people working, and focused on what they did. So I think that's a lot to be proud about.
it's true.
You think about how tough the economy got in Flint, particularly in the late 70s, the early 80s. What were you thinking when you woke up? What did you talk to my dad about when that period of time hit?
The basic thing was it was harder to deal with many customers. Either they demanded more or they weren't satisfied with whatever the price we gave them. They wanted to buy for less. It was just difficult with the customers.
Yeah, that was a tough period of time. And for sure, less of them working
Yes.
the way they worked before, so less income meant less disposable income. So appreciate that was a tough period of time. And Miller Road expansion created complication
That's right.
for sure. And you guys used to go up there all the time and look at things, but it wasn't comfortable to both of you, and so you didn't pursue that. Probably the right thing to do at the end of the day, but who knew? But you stayed focused on your lane, and you stayed focused on the business, and both of you were very good at that.
The store was a lifesaver for Leo Binder. He was retired, and it was a pleasure for him to get up in the morning and come to the store just to hang out. And so many times a customer would walk into the store and he would immediately jump up and greet them and have something to say to them, and they're wondering what this elderly man wants. They weren't quite sure if he was a salesman, but it was great.
My grandfather was hard of hearing, your father, and in the late 70s and early 80s, when the economy was changing, he would sit in the front and one of you would make a transaction and the deal was signed, and he'd watch the customer go out the door and he didn't know, and he'd chase them and say, "Don't leave, my boys will make it cheaper for you." And either you or my dad would run after him and say, "We just made the sale," and you put your hands up and tell him to stop. He was well in his 90s at that point when the store was in its last few years, and hard if you did something every day and your wife was gone already and you were alone. It was a place to go to, and it was a place to be engaged with people. So not just managing a business, but you were managing your father at the same time, and not easy.
Leo Binder was one special person.
He was.
He used to eat dinner. He lived in an apartment by himself. He used to eat dinner, and he lived in an apartment project a block from McLaren Hospital and the other hospital.
Osteopath, Flint osteopath.
What?
Flint osteopath.
Flint osteopath.
Yeah.
He finished dinner, walked to one of the hospitals, walked through the hall, just walk into the hall, into a room of some patient he never met before, and just sit down and start talking with them. And the nurses followed him for the first few days until they realized he was harmless, and they just let him do what he wanted to do.
he was in his 90s and had all his faculties and was a fairly healthy person. He was hard of hearing, and that would create confusion. But
He was going to be 94, and we got a call that he was hit by a car. We told him to go, when he goes to the hospitals, to go to where the lights were and cross the street when the lights turn green. And he figured he could do whatever he wanted to do. So that's the way he was hit by a car.
March of 1983. 1 week after your birthday. On a Friday night. Certainly tough business, not easy. You had to work hard. Reflecting back, what was the most fun when you think about the time Reliable was around?
Working with customers who were easy to get along with, and satisfying them with merchandise that they liked, prices that they liked, and we making a sale. It was just nice.
I just remember I took an interest in it. I loved being there. I liked being around my father. I loved being around you. And I would watch what was going on and had this interest in the industry anyway. That customer interaction is very difficult to explain to anybody who didn't watch it themselves. The way a customer would smile or call you out by name or ask about your family or how you were doing or what your health situation was if there was ever a problem. But they were part of the family, one way, shape, or form. And that trust is just difficult to explain. And I think, the relationship between my father and you was extraordinary. And that common bond and that trust was amazing, and reflect on how unique Reliable was to other businesses where you never saw that level of trust and bond. And there were roles and responsibilities that each of you played, and that was a compliment to what the end result was. And I never forgot that, for sure. And I thought that was just fascinating. Fast track the question earlier, what you would, give advice to. I think that relationship is what's required in any business, and how you trust two people to get along and ensure that there's honesty, integrity is how businesses move, and never lose touch with your customer.
When you realize Flint had 74,000 people working for General Motors, and one day General Motors just said, we're quitting Flint, and 74,000 jobs were lost. And that was a lot of our customers.
Yes. That was tough to watch. And, neighborhoods, whole neighborhoods where we had customers, we knew them by name, or their children or their grandchildren were no longer working, or they moved to, a different job at half the pay of what one made at General Motors. And that changed a lot, for sure. Not just Reliable, but it changed Miller Road. It changed everything drastically.
The largest business for a long time was movers who moved families all over the United States, just moving them out of Flint.
Remember when business was challenging, you had a group of drivers on demand, and when the transaction was taken care of, my dad and you decided better deliver it instantaneously so they don't change their minds, because the market really changed a lot. So if there was a transaction 2 or 3 on a Saturday afternoon, the customer got their furniture that afternoon. And the feeling was if they had it, then they'd be satisfied. They wouldn't go home. They wouldn't go out and look at additional prices. And the customer really did change. That was work, and a different level of effort than it was in the 60s. And wonder if that was really sustainable. But for Reliable, it was sustainable for a while. And that was what made the business, I think, so interesting or so distinct, better way maybe to say it, because you pivoted when the customer changed, and that's what kept the business alive. But the customer was definitely changing. My father was born in 25. Actually, today would be his birthday. And he was born in the back of the store.
Was he born?
He was born in the back of the store.
Oh.
So we used to say, well, you were born in 24 in Newark and then came back to Flint.
Right.
And my father was born in the back of the store. We used to make a joke that he was born into a family business because he was born in the back of the store. That was the joke that we always said about him. But what's really unclear is what was 1925 to 1928? What was Stewart and Industrial then?
Oh.
There was something there. If that makes sense.
I don't understand.
Yeah, there's a gap in that we don't understand.
There must be.
But there was a business, and there were family members that were involved a little bit. But at the end of the day, my father was born November this day, 1925, in the back of the store. And, you know, from talking to him, and of course talking to my uncle for a long time, they were very poor. I mean, they worked hard, and they had ambition, and they wanted to do well, but they were very poor. And nothing, of course, was easy. And two immigrant parents that had to assimilate into the United States, and tough, but never clear what 25 to 28 was, other than it was hard.
Could it have been one of the other stores where they were just renting?
Could have been.
Yeah.
Could have been for sure. But
Yeah.
we have records. We know, we don't know what it was. We just know his birth records. We know his address from his birth records. And so, you know, even when you look at census data, which is public at this point, there was something there, but it's never been quite clear.
That's interesting.
Yeah. But I think, you know, it still reflect, though, and Harry said this in the beginning of the talk, but that neighborhood was an immigrant neighborhood, very Eastern European, very Polish backgrounds, strong Polish backgrounds for sure, and we were Jewish, and two grandparents who were really wonderful people. You talk about my grandfather. My grandmother was a really wonderful person, but they were assimilating into the U.S. And so when we were upstairs, we 8, 9 years old, my father and my uncle took responsibility to learn to drive, because to push the business and to eat needed a push. And you had two partners, or two brothers, that became adults very quickly. And a father that appreciated, that he needed some help in that regard, but he was a worker. He was not a lazy person. So it's the DNA of reliable. But that period, Uncle Harry, from 25 to 28, other than the space that they rented, and there were a few things going on, never totally clear.
Well, when the furniture store was on Industrial Avenue, it was not a large building, and 2/3 back from the front, a wall was put up 2/3 of the way up, and the back third was where we lived. One big room, and my brother and I slept in one corner of the building, and the folks slept in another corner of the back. And one of the used appliances that came in was a Detroit Jewel gas range, which was the cream of the crop in those days. And my mother and father spent 2 weeks cleaning that stove until it was like new, and then he had it hooked up. And my mother used to do all the cooking and baking on that stove. Saturday night was bathing night. My mother filled a galvanized tub with hot water. My brother and I took turns getting into this galvanized tub and taking a bath. Until one day, our father said, "We're going to take a shower." And we don't know what he was going to do. He took us to Burston Fieldhouse, which was about 8 blocks away. And it was the first time that we had the experience of standing underneath a shower. I didn't want to go home. It was such a great feeling. But
How old were you?
Never forget it.
How old were you then?
Huh?
How old were you then?
Probably 6, 7 years old.
Yeah. And that's the thing, that's how both brothers grew up and
Yeah.
became, I would say, super responsible adults earlier than most children, because they had to take extraordinary responsibility for what's ahead. But two brothers that extremely well honored their parents and never, negated where they came from or where they were in life. It was just a system of support, and that's how it worked. So sometimes when I reflect on conversations, or I would go to that old store when I was 3 or 4 years old, and I have vivid memories of it, and I'd go to the back of that store and just wonder, what was being told to me so much about growing up. I think that's just the backbone of the DNA of the business. It was a very hard-working work ethic of two people that never ever forgot their roots. Those are hard roots to come from, and never forgot what it took to go from where they started to where it became. And, families extended from that and are where they are today because that model was very consistent. And many businesses in Flint very successful, and nothing, we would talk about this all the time, but this business, quiet and not out in the open, never a brag, not a materialistic group of people. As they did better, they would enjoy a nice car, but they didn't promote themselves materially. You took care of your families, and you were very focused on ensuring the success of the business and the stability of the business. And for that, I think it's pretty impressive. And a lot to thank Flint. And to say, you know, I was very close with my dad and we talked a lot. Same with you. There were two things you never said negative as children growing up. You never said anything negative about Flint, ever. Two brothers had the same answer all the time. Flint has been very good to us, that's what they would say. Consistent. The words would be the same. The focus on the words would be the same. And the second is, as businesses changed in Flint, Genesee Valley became something in retail, downtown became less, and Miller Road expanded, you never challenged the business model. The answer was, this business takes care of two families, and this business is successful, and you just accepted that. You had to really understand what both of them did. You had to really understand what both of you did every day. And that was what was really special about Reliable, was that you had two brothers that came in, made sure that their parents were safe and secure, and managed a very diverse customer base and a very complex business. And I think it's very impressive. I learned a lot. Well, I did learn a lot. I learned a lot. In anything I did in life, I always reflect on a few things. Even I remember when I first started in the industry, I started in, of all places, Atlanta, Georgia. And I remember my dad coming down to see me. And he'd walk around and he'd see the store that I managed back then. And I started in a company, you know, at the bottom. And he was asking all these questions about how you interact with a customer and what do you do and how do you deal with customer complaints. And everything was always rooted back to what both of them dealt with in the business. And so much about that business, the core part of that business, stuck with me for forever. And that's, if I have been successful, I owe much of that to the relationship that I got to nourish with my dad and with my uncle. And, you know, I think that's what makes Reliable successful. And I'm very proud of it.
That's true with, I think, all of you kids.
I think so.
Yeah.
There's just nothing that one can say to discount the role of integrity and the role of hard work. And there's nothing to discount at the same time the role and responsibility to ensure a family is safe and protected. And that was a real distinction. And I will never forget that. And I just, you know, David is closest to me in age, and I remember even coming out of high school, sometimes he was downtown and I was downtown at the same time, but we had both been to the store at some point in that afternoon. And our experiences in a lot of respects were the same. It was just awesome to see, to go into the business. And if the business model, if business wasn't great, you knew it. They were not, my dad or my uncle, in the very best of moods, but they sheltered much of that from us. But you could feel, you know, their own pressure, and you could feel their own tension. But they were good at filtering, and they were good at staying focused on their job, and they always found solutions as things got much more complicated. But to me, that was most unique. I thought it was very impressive.
I remember the years when furniture came in not put together, and we learned to use a screwdriver and put whatever we had to put them together in order to sell it. It was a good experience. The store was in a major Polish neighborhood, and the fact that my dad came from Poland, a customer would come in and they would begin talking in Polish, and they got along. It was that simple.
Has Flint been good to you?
Overall, yes. Yes.
Why?
Even going to Flint Junior College was a great experience. And that was a little school, but we managed quite well.
It's just wherever you go in this country or this world, growing up in Flint, watching what my dad and my uncle leveraged or lived through or handled, it was a very successful city for a period of time. It went through some political change for a period of time, and then obviously the economy changed, but they didn't change. And they always, from my recollection, and I think you would agree with me, you never forgot your roots, and you never forgot where you came from. And I found both of you, my dad always talked about this, you just never forgot what it took to get where you were, and you never took a risk that you could ever go backwards. And you knew the difference between the best and the worst of times, and I think that's what was so. I think that's one of the distinctions that made the whole business so different,
Well,
so
Flint
interesting.
had so many good years that we just rode along with it and accepted it.
You know, the relationship we had, you had, my father had with Citizens Bank, when the markets changed, or Michigan National Bank, or Detroit Northern Bank when they were still downtown, Genesee Bank, and when credit got more complicated, sometimes you couldn't carry a customer's paper. But what always made you distinguished from reliable, distinguished from the rest of the market, is you had enough of a relationship with the banks that you could get customers credit, and that enabled spending, that kept the economy moving differently than other people talk about. So having integrity around the city was as important as having the integrity with your customer, I found.
I remember the story. My dad couldn't pay the monthly payments on the store that he had built, and the bank repossessed the store. A few months later, they came back to him and said, "We want to give you this back, the store." He said, "I can't make the payments." They said, "Do what you can do." And he wasn't able to do that much. My brother and I, after we started our new business, and I don't know how many years later, we made the last payment to Citizens Bank on the store, and it was ours.
I remember when my father was sick in his last few months, and I'd go to Citizens Bank for something. The relationship that you had, that my father had with those banks was extraordinary, and people would find the time to talk about it. And that was impressive. And it goes back, to a question I asked you earlier, or a statement I made. I think that's what made Reliable so distinctive, was those relationships were core to how we stayed in business. And customers felt that, and external partners felt that, and so that was distinct. And, say something different. We were never canceled for insurance. There were times in Flint when that was tough. We had workers support us. There were certainly challenges, but generally workers supported us. And the backbone of the business relied on the integrity and the role and responsibility of two brothers that had very distinct responsibilities, but they trusted each other. And so it worked. And others, businesses, furniture businesses, because we were conditioned to look at others, but other businesses didn't work or eventually lost.